This is Father Gregory Pine,
And this is Father Bertrand Janczyk.
and welcome to Godsplaining. Thanks to all of those who support us. If you enjoy the show, please consider making a monthly donation on Patreon. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you listen to your podcasts. Father Jacob Bertrand, I feel like this is the first episode that we have recorded in some time, which means like 3 weeks. But since that last episode that we recorded, let's see, we've celebrated Holy Week and the Easter Triduum.
Yes.
How was your Holy Week? How are you doing?
Yeah, it was holy. It was a week long, so it was great. Very holy. Yeah, it was good. I was here at Thousand Studies, which was nice. It's kind of like liturgy overload in a good way. So, yeah, it's beautiful. A lot of beautiful traditions coming from like Dominican stuff, and then just regular, not stuff, but like Dominican liturgy, and obviously the sort of the regular sort of liturgy. So it was beautiful. It was good, fun to celebrate on Easter Sunday and the like. So yeah, bless. Can't complain. I should say this has nothing to do with Easter, but this is the third for those keeping track at home. The last couple episodes I've recorded were with Father Bonaventure and Father Patrick, and each time we started, it was the same kind of comment, like, we haven't recorded with one another for a long time. And so now I'm thinking, like, who have I been recording with? Because everybody's saying the same. But alas, here we are. How was Easter? And I was gonna say your Easter, as if that like you had a different one, but how was it?
That was good. Let's see. Yep, it was like yours, except different. And it was the first time that I did the washing of the feet. I think it was the first time that I've ever celebrated the Holy Thursday liturgy. I mean, I've concelebrated before, but I haven't been the principal celebrant. And it was nice because I'm the youngest priest in the community, and the oldest priest is a friar who's Swiss, who's 85 years old, Father Adrian. And so I celebrated and he preached, which was cool. And I tried to offer to the prior like the foot washing section of the liturgy, because I don't know, it's a Dominican custom that the prior would do that. But he's like, nah. He's like, you are acting in persona Christi in a peculiar way for the liturgy itself, so you should do the feet washing. And I was like, okie dokie. So it was wild. It was humbling. I mean, this is just me being honest. I typically don't love the foot washing, just because it, like many things in the past, however many years, has become politicized in a lot of church conversations. So I'm just like, what if we just omitted it and just skipped that whole argument? But the Dominican custom is to wash the feet of the community. And I was washing the feet of men with whom I live, and it was humbling. It was simple, and I was like tripping over my vestments and moving from friar to friar, and it was a kind of dumpster fire insofar as I was the one who was presiding, and I lack your ars celebrandi. But I very much appreciated the opportunity to just do something simple in service, because I can be a brat, and so it's good to mortify one's tendency to be a brat. And then cool. Now in the Easter Octave, cool thing is that book that I have been talking about for like way too long, that I wrote about prudence. It's like, I wrote a book about prudence, and people are like, oh, cool, when it's coming out? And I'm like, I have no idea. But I finally do, because it is out. It's like when people ask, are you called to the priesthood? I'm like, pretty sure, leading up to ordination. I'm like, yeah, now I think I'm definitely sure. So I wrote a book, and I'm definitely sure because it's available. So it's called Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly, and it's available wherever books are sold. And and at least one person in the world likes it, because I do. So that for me is a great consolation, even if an egotistical one.
When you said the subtitle, Choose Confidently, right? Was that it? Prudence?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I thought you said it first. Well, I know the title of the book because I've seen it and I have a copy, but I thought it sounded like you said Juice Confidently, like it was a workout book. Prudence, Juice Confidently.
Yeah. It's about working out and making fresh smoothies.
Love it. Love both of them. So if you're interested in working out and smoothies, this is the book for you. Also, if you're interested in reading something Father Gregory wrote, this is the book for you. And if you're interested in learning about prudence and like decision making and the like, this is the book for you. So there's really not a reason not to buy it, because either work out, drink smoothies, you want to hear more from Father Gregory, yikes, or you want to learn about a virtue, good. Those are the reasons.
It just covers such a wide customer base.
Yep. It's great. And it's like 18-point font and like 4 pages long. So you'll love it. It's really accessible.
It's like a pamphlet, let's be honest. Um, Dig. So yeah, so that's cool. But here in this episode, we're going to talk not so much about prudence as we are about love, which is a virtue, but it's also a reality which embraces more of our human lives. Sweet Christmas, Lord, teach me how to speak. Amen. Alleluia. It embraces more of our human lives insofar as it kind of makes our lives whole. It makes our lives orderly. So we're going to dive into that subject. All right. So Father Jacob Bertrand, would you set the stage for us? What is maybe a little bit of an introduction to the present crisis of love or the present difficulty that we experience in trying to order our lives well in a way that reflects the love of God for us and the love that we ought to bear out to others?
Yeah, I think again, yet perhaps a tired trope of like, well, you can look at the world and see how wrong things are, but there is a lot to, I guess, to say, or different ways to talk about love and our capacity for it and our expression of it, like how we're made to love and how humans ought to love well, and then also the corollary of like how that goes wrong or wrongly. But yeah, for because our episodes are only so long and people only care so much to listen to us, one of the things, like an angle or a way by which I think it's worth something I think that is worth talking about is this idea of like what is the end of human love and how do we pursue that. And I think that can be highlighted perhaps by a couple examples that are prevalent in some I guess minds of the world, of the secular world, and also the Christian world. And I guess that's sort of like what would I say? Let's use two examples, right? So this somebody proposed to me this idea, not to me. It's I mean I guess it was to me, but it wasn't just a one-off proposal, but this idea of like, well, why can't Catholics have civil unions? Like, isn't there? Why can't Catholics have civil unions so as to what for those who perhaps are living the church's teachings on sexuality but might be same-sex attracted, why can't they enjoy a friendship that also kind of enjoys the civil benefits that society provides people who spend their lives together? Like, why is that only reserved to married people, and why can't even people who don't experience same-sex attraction, like why can't friends who are going to be single have these sort of benefits? So this idea of like Catholic civil unions, is that a wrong thing? Is that a bad thing? How does that kind of like, I don't know, stand contrary, or does that stand contrary to what we understand human love to be and human relationships to be? So that perhaps, I don't know if that fleshes out the problem enough, but at least a place to start thinking about like, well, what does proper human love look like? What is the end of that? And if we understand the end, then how do we kind of approach and kind of strive towards that? So that's kind of what we're looking to talk about and kind of set up.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the rhetoric in contemporary debates is not thinking in terms of there being an end to love. So, like a fancy word that we use in philosophical conversation is teleological. So, there's an end, and then we can observe a kind of tendency to the end, and that tendency shapes our discourse and it shapes our reality. But I think a lot of what we hear in the secular world or as it's presented by the media is anti-teleological or non-teleological. So, like love is love or love wins doesn't answer the question like, okay, well, what is love for or win what battle? It's just a kind of general affirmation or a kind of unconditional positive regard, but it doesn't necessarily think of, what the person is for and how the person ought to attain to that end. And one of your insights, just talking about this before, is that if we're going to know the end or if we're going to work effectively for the end, then we need to know who we are, because the principle at stake here is a nature. And sometimes you hear people talk about human nature. And nature is a principle both of being and of unfolding. It sets the terms for what this thing is. And when you know what this thing is, then you have a better sense of what it's for. So like when you know what a hammer is for, then you're better suited to use it as such. But if you don't know what it's for, then you might stir your soup or scrape plaque off your teeth, all of which or both of which would be super destructive. So when getting at the identity so as to get at the unfolding of the human person, what are some basic things that we want to have in place, basic principles?
Yeah, I think at least three that we can enumerate and talk about briefly with respect to human sexuality. because we have to talk about the human. All right, before we can talk about the end of what our love is, as Father Gregory was saying, we have to understand at least briefly what the person is and how our sexuality is part of our humanity. And then once we have that, we can talk about, okay, well, understanding that sexuality is part of humanity, what does our human sexuality move towards this end that Father Gregory is talking about? So first thing I think is super important, and something that we often get wrong, is this idea of wholeness, or like an integrity to the person, right? That whenever we're considering uh, a human being, or a specific like phenomenon, or something that a human being does, it has to be and can only be properly understood with reference to the person as a whole. So when we think about like, uh, by way of example, when we think about human love and loving and human sexuality, it doesn't, we can talk about it in a sort of vacuum. We can talk about like, well, what is sexuality and how is it lived well? But we have to do that with reference to the person as a whole. And what I mean by that is that we are not simply sexual beings. It's part of who we are, and the part of, and that part of us contributes to the wholeness of us in similar ways, like exercise, right? Like a human being is not simply somebody who can exercise and get stronger and read Father Gregory's book Prudence, Juice. What was it? What's the yeah, his book
Choose
on juicing.
confidently
Well,
and live
juice
boldly.
confidently, right? Yeah, like there are things that we do as human beings, but they contribute to the whole of us. We can't divorce part of what we do uh, from other parts of what we do. We're a whole integrated being, and what we do with and in our sexuality redounds to the person. So that's one thing, that at least by way of starting, that it's we can't simply atomize our lives into discrete kind of parts and say that these don't affect who we are or how we do other things, or this or that sort of thing. I don't know if that makes sense, but we'll at least start there. Um, the second thing is what we call in like philosophical or theological terms, that human beings are hylomorphic, two forms. I don't know, Father Gregory, if you want to say a bit about that. Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
but that it relates to the first for sure.
Yeah, so hylomorphic just meaning whatever. It comes from two Greek words which mean matter and form. So the matter is the kind of stuff, and then the form is what gives the stuff its shape, or what makes the stuff to be this kind of stuff. So the form, or like what gives shape to the human person, is the soul, and then the matter would be like the body. But it's made to be a human body by the human soul. So the two taken together make up the human person. The human person we sometimes refer to as a composite of matter and soul, or of body and soul, or matter and form and body and soul. So there's a sense in which like our bodies kind of bear out our souls. Ludwig Wittgenstein. That's more difficult to say than I originally thought. He says that, like you want to take a good picture of the soul, the best picture of the, excuse me. Yeah, you want to take a good picture of the soul, the best picture of the soul is the body, because the body is, like what the material world looks like when shaped by the soul. So yeah, when you get at it from this angle, you have a better appreciation of the integrity of the human person, like Father Jacob Bertrand had mentioned, but also of this interplay between body and soul, that they're not just set next to each other or on top of each other, but that they are in intimate union, and that their intimate union shapes both, and that we, as a human person, bear that out, which kind of leads into the third and final point that you had introduced.
Yeah. Yeah, the third point is, as we've already been talking about, that the person, us as human beings, are ordered to an end. We're made for something. Ultimately, that something is union with God. As you know, that's the highest good, that's the highest end. St. Thomas introduces the idea of this end in terms of happiness, that we're made for happiness, fulfillment, ultimately, perfect happiness and fulfillment in God. There are lower goods, great goods, but lower goods. Here we're talking about love, one of the great goods of being a human person. It's ordered to God in the end. But this is where I guess the rubber hits the road in this conversation, because if the person is a whole, right, we can't atomize our different actions in ways that make them discrete and unrelated, because we're one human being as a person. And if we're body and soul, matter and form, what we do with our bodies affects our souls, and as a body soul composite moving towards God, that affects our end, what we're aimed at. So our sexuality certainly is a bodily thing. Sexual differentiation is a material thing. It's a bodily thing. But because we are hylomorphic and whole, also the beauty of human love is that it encompasses, or it involves intimately, and our the reality of our souls. That like love is not just a physical thing, but something that involves our intellect and our will, our ability to know and to love, and all of that is ordered towards happiness and fulfillment. So we have these three things, these three sort of foundational points, that like the human person is whole, the human person is body and soul, and that this body soul whole composite is ordered to work together, to move together by grace, to share in divine life and happiness. And we can have a sort of foretaste of that in our relationships, most especially in not our, I don't have any romantic relationships, but in romantic relationships, and the love shared between two human beings, between man and woman. And this is sort of the next point, right, that we're going to talk about, is that human sexuality is fulfilled in, these things being the case, human sexuality is fulfilled in, or sort of the height of that is in the married state. Well, why? The reason for that is, when I talk about marriage and like human love being fulfilled by this, I always return to the Code of Canon Law, because I think their definition of marriage is really solid. And the line that I really like there is that the definition is the matrimony or the marriage covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, and which is ordered by its nature, right? So what it's aimed at, to the good of the spouses, holiness, and the procreation and education of offspring, right? So the matrimonial covenant by which a man and woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life. Like, here's this idea of wholeness again, that it's within the context of the sacramental bond of marriage, that this wholeness of life is shared. So I don't know, Father Gregory, how this, I guess, relates back to this sort of idea of like the person being a whole ordered toward an end. But how does this kind of come alive then in our idea of like how do we love well and like move towards that end?
Yeah, I think maybe a good principle to introduce at this point is one of order. So I'm thinking, we introduce the notion of nature, and we say that nature is a principle of being and of unfolding. So it sets the terms for what we are, and it also sets the terms for how we are to flourish. And nature is the basis of the natural law, which a lot of people have heard bandied about, but not necessarily heard described. And the natural law basically says that, because we're human beings, because we partake of the life of reason, but we do so in an embodied way, and certain goods are going to present themselves to us, because those goods build up who we are and help us attain to our perfection. And so we experience our relationship like with these goods as a kind of inclination or attraction or desire, not necessarily at a conscious level, but in a very profoundly human level. But we don't just follow all of our desires simultaneously, because those desires have to be ordered in light of, you saw it coming, the end. So like, for instance, on account of the fact that we exist, that we're substances, we have a desire to, or an inclination to keep existing. So things that are in being like to stay in being because it's in their best interest to be, because there's no future without being. And so in light of this fact, we're inclined to eat and to drink and to procreate, because by doing so, we maintain our own individual existence, but also propagate the existence of the species. But then those desires are actually called up into higher order desires. Because we're animals, right? We have a tendency not only just like to procreate like indiscriminately, but to procreate in the context of a kind of family or tribe or whatever, clan, however you describe them, a gaggle, a pride. What do you call a ravens? Ravens are in murders, I think, is the name of a group of ravens. Whatever. Okay, keep going. But that desire is called up into this higher desire to, like procreate and educate children, right? To kind of introduce them into a society of a certain sort. And then on account of the fact that we're rational, we have a desire to know the truth about God and to live well in the context of political life and social life and family life, but to do so with the idea of kind of establishing a certain peace or tranquility, to enjoy the fruits of the earth or the goods of the earth yet more excellently. So we've got all these different tendencies or inclinations or desires at work in our life, but we need them to be ordered. And when you say something concretely like human love is for marriage, it places itself within that, whatever maelstrom of desires in an orderly fashion. So it's not just about eating and drinking and having sexual intercourse and procreating and educating. It's to do so in the context of like a family unit, which contributes to or participates in the life of the state, which ultimately is ordered to the acknowledgement and to the worship of God. So I think that when we see it in that context, like there is a natural law at work in our members, that law is worked out in order, specifically, by the cultivation of virtues, among which virtues there is love or charity, that we flourish, right, by placing a certain order in and among these desires and seeing them through to their genuine term. So maybe with that, then I can just bounce it back to you to think about some of the issues that like with these things in mind, certain issues that we can think through more effectively or think through more efficiently in light of the distinctions that we've drawn.
Yeah, I think with in this sort of question of like, can there be Catholic civil unions? Like, is that an appropriate place for people, even if, to live in a way, even if it were sort of chaste, to live in a way that kind of approximates marriage in its form as a civil union? Or can there be such things as like exclusive, chaste, same-sex relationships where two people who identify perhaps as gay or same-sex attracted spend their lives together in a way that sort of approximates like marital fidelity, but without the sort of sexual component, living chastely? Like, are those things legitimate? Are those legitimate ways to approach the end that we've been talking about our humanity and our human sexuality? The answer to those questions has to be sort of no. Well, why? Well, because of what we've been talking about. But here are some sort of like inherent issues, as Father Gregory was saying, in this sort of question, at least how I've framed it and proposed it. And one of these is that in order to sort of enter into a, whether that's like the Catholic quote unquote civil union or a chaste same-sex relationship, it's dependent on defining oneself based on sexual preference. But in reality, what defines a person is not sexual orientation or sexual desires or even the capacity to like have sex or procreate or these sort of things. What's definitive of the person is our capacity to know and to love, and our ability to give of ourselves. These are the defining sort of characteristics of like the essence of who we are as men and women. And our sexuality is included in that, but it's not determinative of that. It's not the final sort of defining characteristic of who we are as human persons. So this might be a sort of, I don't know, a more kind of like nuanced, I don't know if nuance is the right word, but maybe not a kind of front line kind of argument to make, but is an important one. That, remember, like as a human person, we're whole. We can't be defined, and we shouldn't be defined by this or that part of who we are without regard for who we are as an integrated human being. So with respect to our sexuality, it can't be a defining factor of who we are because we're more than that. And in the end, our sexuality is for more than simply like the rights of us enjoyed in a civil union or these sort of things. It's ultimately, our sexuality is ultimately oriented, and when healed and transformed by grace, to holiness, to be made holy. And as Father Gregory was explaining, with these ends in mind, that there's a particular sort of way by which men and women are made holy in living their sexuality well and fully. So I don't know if you have addendums or additions to that, Father Gregory.
Yeah, maybe just to make addition or spell it out further, or just wax ineloquent for some number of minutes, which is my usual wont. But yeah, I think that, like you said, you set it up. We're made to the image of God, so our destiny, our dignity, is to know and to love God with our whole mind, heart, soul, and strength, and our neighbor as ourself. And God, in His predestinating love, calls us to certain concrete expressions of that love. So we all have the same vocation insofar as we're all called to a kind of covenant love with God in heaven, but it's not a vocation to which we attain like solipsistically or individualistically. It's one that we attain to in communion, because God, who is communion, calls us to communion through communion. All right. And so He calls certain persons to certain states of life, to priesthood, to religious life, or to marriage. And then for whatever reason, some people do not enter into a state of life, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a vocation, because their vocation is to the vision of God in heaven, as we have described. So then we think about, these different means, as it were, these different states of life, which participate that one vocation and so are rightly called vocations in those terms, right? They're for the knowledge and love of God. And so we're receptive to God's revelation of himself and to the grace that he gives. And like you said, when somebody defines themselves or him or herself by sexual orientation and then crafts a kind of response in light of that, which kind of steps outside or steps, kind of like parallel to the tradition, it can represent a kind of break from the general tendency or the kind of overall tendency to receive from God a revelation of himself and then a grace to respond in a way to which he calls, right? So I think that there's a kind of anxiety that maybe I don't have a vocation, as a result of which maybe I am ill-made. And that's not the point. The point is we're all called to the vocation, like you said, of knowing and loving God to the utmost extent, to do so perfectly. And that these different means are disposed, or they're kind of made available to us towards that end. But ultimately, it doesn't mean reshaping the notion of marriage, which itself is revealed and kind of refurbished by our Lord Jesus Christ, appealing back to Genesis 2 and the revelation of the Old Testament and saying like, no, this is a real thing. And just because we find it difficult doesn't mean that we change it. Or just because we have particular struggles with chastity, which make it impossible for us to enter into this marital union, again, it doesn't mean that we change it. So I think there's a kind of contemplative disposition which informs all of our thoughts and actions vis-a-vis marriage, which is namely that God reveals himself, calls us to himself, and then reveals the means and calls us through those means. And marriage is about procreation and education of children and the mutual support of the spouses. So you can only undertake it with those things in mind. Mind you, there are a lot of asterisks, and that's a whole nother episode. Like, what about people who are aged and as a result of which can't procreate? Okay, that's another question, but it's a good one. So I think that kind of helps to shape our thoughts about how we approach the question of our vocation, the state of life to which we may be called, or may have already embarked upon or may yet be to embark upon, and then how we go about loving in and through those things. So I think that the distinctions that you drew at the outset set it up well. And then at that point, we're in a better place to receive from the Lord what it is that he has to reveal. But as we draw down, I don't know if you have final things that you want to suss out, final things that you want to concretize.
Yeah, I think often and this is not just with chastity or sexuality, but with a lot of vices that we have, that the idea is that like what accomplishment in the Christian life is just to sort of like have control over things in our lives, such that we're simply not sinning, but like that we're going to that we're going to fight these things for the rest of our life. And there's a whole host of ways that we can talk about that with respect to human sexuality. But ultimately, we shouldn't look at like the pursuit of virtue and goodness and holiness as a simple struggle. There's a struggle to get there, but the struggle is not the end. The end is a sort of is a perfection and a freedom in grace, and that includes our sexuality. And it's important to recognize that human sexuality is because the human person is a whole thing, not a compartmentalized, atomized thing. Our human sexuality, when lived well and when lived, aided by grace, actually contributes to our holiness. It makes us holy. It makes us saints. When a married couple engages in the conjugal act, when they have sex, that contributes to their holiness. When unmarried people pursue chastity and these things, that contributes to their holiness. When those who have taken vows, are ordained priests, are celibate, that contributes to their holiness. So which ultimately is the end, which is the end for all of us, to be holy, not to simply struggle. That's often part of all of our experience, but to be holy. And we have to view our sexuality, which is part of our humanity, as something that contributes, or was made to contribute to that holiness. And I think when we begin to see our lives in those sort of terms, and our sexuality and our ability to love other people in those terms, it begins to make more sense as to why, like, okay, there's a proper way or proper modes of expressing our human sexuality that actually are conducive to our growth and holiness and our pursuit of Christ. So that for me has always been a helpful thing to remember, that it's not, it's ultimately about our union with Christ, and that the whole of our of who we are as human beings is made for that. Not just our minds, not just our hearts, but like our everything that we are is made for that.
Yeah. And then maybe just by way of final thought for me, it's not to make light of the unique and individual sufferings that each human person experiences as a result of the way in which, they are fearfully and wonderfully made, and the way in which they may have been formed or deformed to their delight or to their chagrin. Because God has foreseen it all, right? God has, been about the work of executing a providential plan in our lives, even if it's one that's marked by, weakness and woundedness, by sin, by betrayal, whatever it might be. Yet we know that by his grace, it's possible to heal, it's possible to grow, and it's possible to attain to a certain perfection. That perfection will always be marked by the very real history of our lives. It's not a perfection that papers it over or a perfection that denies it outrightly. Rather, it incorporates it into a story of glory, just like our Lord's wounds become a privileged place of encounter for us as Christians to draw from his glory. So too, the way in which the Lord brings us through a story of trial and temptation, maybe of failure or, of triumph, is a way in which we find a privileged place of encounter with his glory in our own flesh. So I think that, the struggles that people encounter with human sexuality are real. They're in no wise to be denied or to be made light of. But it's for us to receive from God what he reveals and what he gives so that we can grow and become the saints that he desires us to be. Boom. All right. So with that, a word of thanks to all of our supporters. Again, if you'd like to tithe through our work, please check us out at patreon.com/Godsplaining. If you would, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review, all of which help to get the word out and to bring Godsplaining before more people's eyes and ears so that they too might hear a good word. Visit Godsplaining.org to shop merchandise and then to get updates on events. So this summer, like we've said, we have 2 retreats in July and 1 retreat in August, and you are most cordially invited. We'd love to see you there, and applications are available online at Godsplaining.org. So that's it from us. Thanks so much for your prayers for us, and know of our prayers for you. We continue to celebrate the Holy Mass for you weekly and pray the Rosary for you and for your intentions. And until next time, we'll look forward to catching you on Godsplaining. Cheers.